Hi guys, welcome to the JOVED 2020 Accreditation Test Debate results. Thank you for waiting so long for us to make this video. We're very sorry for the late upload, but technical issues here and there. You know the deal, COVID, everything. So please be patient. I'm going to get through this quickly so you can also get your results very quickly. You've already gotten the results for the question and answers in the previous video. If you haven't, then you can probably look for it in this channel as well. So here we go. So general comments based on the results that the other judges gave is that many judges lump together benches during their consideration. For example, they automatically give opposition bench the win over the entire Gov bench, lumping CO with OO, despite quite a lot of elaborations coming from CO being derivative. And it is something that is not fair to do, because if the CO already simply writes on the coattails of OO without giving a lot of new elaborations, then it really makes the government bench less valued. And we believe that you shouldn't do that. You should value teams one by one and not just entire benches, unless both teams in that bench have different elaborations that can be fully credited. Second, many H were also not directly comparative with their assessment. We see this as very problematic, especially in your OAs later on, because you can't simply say, oh, OG got first because they were able to explain their BOP better without directly comparing it to the other teams, how they were able to explain their own BOP and etc. Or why another team loses because they were not able to prove their arguments. Those sorts of assessments are not good. I'm going to give you guys the example of how to assess it in a way that not only makes it easier for you, but especially for the debaters, for them to be satisfied with your assessment. Because at the end of the day, if you're a chair, the person giving you those scores will be the debaters themselves. Lastly, I think many ECT were also still spending a lot of their time in their OA giving feedbacks. Like, for example, OG could improve their case by this, or giving general comments that take up 2 to 3 minutes. We see this is just not efficient. Again, you're not the coach. If you look at the judge brief, we already told you, you are not their coach. You are simply there to assess their their actual debate as it is. That being said, here are the results. We give the first to opening opposition, second to opening government, third to closing government, and fourth to closing opposition. With those scores, I'm going to justify them later. First, let's go with the comparisons. Why did CO get fourth? Their main contributions were, number one, a lot of engaging negation on the status quo progress that is at best very derivative of OO. They talked about how though there will be a lot of support already. There's already a lot of progress in giving women maternity leave or giving them economic support as well. This was, although they might have had a few new examples here and there, most of this idea and the nuance that was brought was much stronger in OO. So we can't credit this to the CO case. Second, their other contribution was talking about how women in developing nations cannot access it, it being the technology we talked about in the motions. Two reasons why it's weak in this at the end of the day. Number one, the idea of women in developing nations cannot access it is not comparative as to how they can provide to the support that will extend directly to those developing nations. Like, why are their ideas on economic support or their ideas of education? Why are all of those logically and process-wise easier to distribute to developing nations? So they can't simply put the burden on this technology to be ultra accessible without they themselves giving that comparative. And again, their only comparative was mostly talking about things that OO already talked about. So at the end of the day, we couldn't really credit this. A lot of the judges were able to be trapped into this framing. But the second reason why this argument in particular is not that relevant is because they never explain why women in developed nations are also less prioritized. Their only line of elaboration was talking about how there's less economic opportunity in developing nations, but not necessarily enough to trade off the entire developed nation part of the feminist movement. Direct comparisons to the other teams. OO were able to beat CO for under two main reasons. Number one, OO were able to specify the loss of progress in the process of advocating for pregnancy. So specifically talking about pregnancy, OO already gave a lot of nuances and picturizations as to why there's progress that will be lost if we follow this proposal. And secondly, the outcome of that is also it will be a tougher fight for maternity at the end of the day if we follow with this proposal. Those elaborations were much more relevant in OO. That's why they beat CO. CG. They were able to also beat CO because at least the idea of the mortality issue of women, saving lives where they can, were directly more relevant as to feminist interests, and it applies both in developed and developing nations. They gave the example of how even US has issues with this, so it's relevant anywhere. And intuitively, you can also think that developing nation um, mothers and children face this issue much more relevant. And secondly, they talked about how they can give them more chance to fight or work. I'm going to give the comparative later as to what their full contribution is, but they explain how this can translate and manifest itself into the economic or work support that closing opposition really wants to talk about. Lastly, compared to OG, OG also already set up the principal idea of how the goal of feminism is to not have inequality. There was not a lot of direct responses from CO on this. They only talked about why it's not accessible, but not why this issue of direct pregnancy, direct issue of artificial womb, why that is actually going to push more inequalities or unequal burdens. And at the end of the day, they were not able to engage with that. And secondly, OG also talked about how they can increase the efficiency or safety of pregnancy itself, which is relevant, which is much more relevant because it directly engages with a lot of the females that we want to talk about in this debate. So for all those reasons, CO got fourth in the debate. Why did CG get third? Their main contributions are twofold. Number one, protecting the health and well-being of mothers and children. Number two, giving more work opportunities. And their conclusion that was relatively new was they want to advance feminism with this new wave of feminism that has a different perspective on pregnancy. We couldn't fully credit both of these claims because number one, the idea of health and well-being already existed and well elaborated in OG. They already directly talked about women working in harsh conditions during their pregnancy and how the children's well-being will be affected by this artificial womb and how it can be much safer. So closing government, at the end of the day, they did spend a little bit more time, but they only provided more picturization or direct mechanism of the technology, but not the elaboration of how it truly affects women, like explaining how you can track the baby's nutrition and all that during their stage as a fetus. That does picturize what the technology looks like, but the actual functions of that technology as to how it can improve the lives of women are not exactly, nothing new there compared to OG. Then second, the idea of giving better work opportunities was already the main case of PM, we can argue. And at the end of the day, DPM also extended this idea. So their idea of more work opportunities, the only thing new is they're concluding about new feminism, but not explaining why either this feminism can be ditched or why this new feminism is exclusively going to be reached through this new form of artificial womb or new wave of pregnancy. So this is why they couldn't get full credit over both of those claims. There are comparisons then. OG beat CG because the safety and this being the most popular choice was already there in opening government. They already talked about how most likely women will choose to do this because of their own safety, because this gives them better work opportunities. So CG pointing that out to as response to OO when they was already credited to OG. That's why they can't really get full credit for this. And CG only elaborated on the problems that are already there, but the solutions were comparatively already there in OG. Second, talking about how they give them the ability to work, the trade-offs in the careers that is bad in status quo, again, already there in opening government. And we can, if you look at the actual elaborations, it is either equal, which means that unless CG is significantly different, then they can't be fully credited for that. Or if they are quite similar in depth, then most likely OG is going to take it because they also already gave that conclusion. Opening opposition, why are they better than CG? Talking about how pregnancy and the experience or difficulty of the pregnancy, opening opposition argued that that is something that women look for, and there is already, and beyond that, there's already a lot of progress in the advocacy for pregnant women. So closing government's urgency on how pregnancy is all bad basically was already preempted by opening opposition, and the idea of pregnancy and experience is already, and that experience being something that women seek for, never responded to by CG. Second, how women at the end of the day will be less prioritized in hiring and maternity leave. The fight for that will become much worse on government world. I'll explain more fully on how this argument played out, but this argument was never really engaged with by CG. They only talked about the benefits of this artificial womb without explaining exactly what potential negative outcomes there are. Next is why OG got second. Since we only have two teams, their main contribution of OG, we're directly comparing it to OO. So firstly, OG talked about it, how it is an unequal burden for women to have carry this child. But OO talked about how, as the feminist movement, we don't want to do this because it will actually put more burden on women to have children. Even if the pregnancy itself will no longer be a burden, to raise these children, to stay at home and raise these children will become the new burden that will be much more imposed on other women, and how the alternative to not have this pregnancy will be seen as something that is irrational because, come on, it's just like technology, right? You don't have to like sacrifice yourself. That's the sort of nuance that will be pushed on these women. So unequal burden will exist on opening government still and will become worse. Second, OG talked about how women will lose out on work opportunities or work time, but OO already responded to this by talking about how they will be less hired and they will be seen as selfish when they want to take maternity leave simply for taking care of these children. Although this was a quite shallow layer of explanation, it is quite believable still, and especially it was never responded to by GovBench, so we are able to credit this to OO. Secondly, OG also talked about when implemented, they are not no longer have to carry the baby for as long as they do now, 9 months or 40 weeks, basically. OO talked about how this is something that's already become part of the norm, and many women has adopted this as a part of their life, and it's something that they have co-opted as something that can be fulfilling in their life rather than being simply a burden, about how it is already glorified and everything. So this response was already also able to negate and flip OG's idea, because now a lot of women will still be able to, or will still opt into this pregnancy. Second, OG talked about how the status quo trade-off is bad, how you have to trade off either your children or your work. OO talked about how this will actually exacerbate the situation for women that do choose to take this trade-off. For example, they talked about how not every single, because of the norms that already exist in the status quo that opening government never responded to, nor closing government, there will still be women who want to carry natural pregnancies, right? And at the end of the day, for the women who do carry natural pregnancies, they will be seen as extra selfish because they had this technology and they're not using it. But second, their fight for maternity leave will also be harder because now taking time off for your pregnancy is going to be seen as something that is completely unnecessary. So this makes it so the whole metric of maternity leave become much worse on on government bench. When talking about losing out on working time, again, OO talked about how maternity leave will lessen due to the fight being based on childcare time, not being as convincing. We recognize that this line of elaboration is not as nuanced as the other arguments, but this line of elaboration still needs to be responded to by government bench for it to be discredited. And at the end of the day, they were not able to do that. Opening government's response on this was only talking about how nurturing can still happen, but they never explained how fulfilling or the level of progress that is there compared to the pregnancy progress that opening opposition talked about. And opening opposition, again, already talked about how it is a harder fight for people to take time off only to nurture their children. It is seen as selfish. Lastly, their argument coming from their DPM talked about the efficiency in the workplace. They never framed why this was part of the feminist agenda to have like pure efficiency. That's more of like a capitalist argument. And OO comparatively says that they want to avoid controversy as the feminist movement. So as far as benefits from this that are not directly reliant on pregnancy, OO were more direct with that. Lastly, why OO got first, the main contributions not yet mentioned that puts them actually above all the other teams. Firstly is the urgency of the movement to stay inclusive and not make a standard for feminism, basically. Very minimal response from the Gov bench, like CG only talked about how it is normal for social movements to be disruptive, but they never explain why as the feminist movement you want to do this, especially taking into account opening opposition already talking about how many women will be excluded from this because they don't either believe in artificial pregnancy or they will be the victims of a harder fight for maternity leave. Second, the coercive behavior that will happen when the technology is implemented. Government bench only run in the best case scenarios where everyone wants to do this and there is no coercion without bringing as much nuance as OO, because OO already talked about how this will directly change people's behavior to tell them to tell women to have these children because it is no longer a biological burden and it is no longer painful to do so. Lastly, they talked about how this will make the fight for artificial wombs become a divisive political topic that seems to be feminist instead of one that's based on safety and relatively bipartisan, mostly talked about on DLO. So this already attacks the entire efficacy of government's entire proposal because the debate doesn't fiat that we have these artificial wombs tomorrow. It only explains what the feminist movement will do and what they will support, but not necessarily that technology is already there tomorrow and it's just a matter of distribution. So to push the development of this thing will be hampered on opening government. That's why on government bench, actually. So that's why opening opposition at the end of the day got first. Quickly, running through the score ranges, PM, GovWhip, member op, and OpWhip only got 74 to 75 ranges because they provided points that were logically true, but with very minimal relevant elaboration. They are only giving like the assertions multiple times or one line of elaboration with not a lot of portrayals. They keep saying they rely on jargonistic things to explain it, like there will be bad trade-offs, they are very vulnerable, it is very efficient, without explaining what is that actual process. Because at this range, they're not able to explain necessarily the processes, incentive structures, etc., to make their arguments more convincing. It is simply an argument for argument's sake. Second, their points were also not as framed as to the importance in the debate from either a feminist protection importance or feminist advancement perspective. So either one of those framing needs to be part of their argument to make you count it as relevant to the debate. Otherwise, it is just argument for argument's sake. Most apparent on CO, because they talked about how the idea of developing nation women being more important, but not necessarily explaining why the protection of developing nation women are less important, or how this can necessarily directly more closing opposition can more directly advance feminism if we don't have this artificial womb. 76 to 78 range. This is the inside speakers of the Gov bench. They provided points that were logically true with sufficient relevant elaborations, and they are already capable of explaining the points with sufficient processes, incentive structures, etc. So basically similar to 74 to 75, but they were able to actually give relatively deeper elaboration, either multiple layers, or they were able to give actor analysis, characterization, and more direct portrayals that are more believable, that doesn't leave the judges simply there to imagine what the argument, how the argument can play out. And their points already included the framing as to the importance in the debate from either the protection importance or advancement perspective. CG talked about how they want to make a new wave of feminism, how this can, how protecting women and their safety exists both on OG and CG. And OG talked about how they also want to advance feminism, so there's less unequal burdens. These protections are, these framing is relevant and is something that you need to credit for the speakers that actually brought them more directly. Lastly, LODLO, why they got 79 to 81. They provide points that were logically true with very relevant elaboration, and they were capable of explaining the points with very rich picturization and processes. So opening opposition didn't just say, well, it's going to make the fight harder. They actually, when they talked about the process of the advocacy being much better now, they give examples of how relevant it is. They give realistic elaboration of how it plays out. They give logically sound explanations as to how it can come to that point. All of those elaborations, including the incentive structures of why people put these coercive natures, have this coercive behavior towards women, and all that also already exists on both OO speeches. Their points also included the framing as to importance from the debate, again, very relevant. And they especially talked about the feminist agenda of how it needs to be super inclusive and it needs to be non-controversial. Those points of framing were not only talked about in OO, they actually elaborated on why they have to be that way and why they have to protect them. Lastly, their points also, they also have get more credit because their points directly engage with the very best cases of their opponents, talking about how if it does pass through, it still, even if it does give safety, even if it does give some advancements, it will still trade off some women, and these women will be more vulnerable. How even if they want to talk about how the technology may be good, the advocacy towards the technology will become worse on their side of the house. So for all of these reasons, 79 to 81 are given to LO and DLO. That concludes the judge test part of the debate. Judge test part of JOVED 2020. If you guys have any other questions, you can probably feel free to either drop them in the comments on this or like ask one of us more directly. Thank you for watching. Good luck for the prelims today.